A seemingly perfect 1907 wedding portrait, until you see what the bride is holding so tightly. The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture as Dr. Maya Robinson carefully opened another archival box. She had been cataloging donations for 3 weeks, sorting through photographs, letters, and documents that told fragments of Black history in the American South. This particular collection had arrived from the estate of a deceased collector in Montgomery, Alabama. Hundreds of photographs spanning from the 1880s through the 1920s. Most showed typical scenes. Families posed stiffly in Sunday clothes, children standing barefoot in cotton fields, churches with congregations gathered outside. Maya pulled out a formal wedding portrait and paused. Something about it immediately unsettled her. The photograph was dated March 1907 on the back, taken in front of a simple wooden church. A young black couple stood together, the groom tall and rigid in a dark suit that seemed too large, the bride petite in a white cotton dress that appeared handmade. But it was the expressions that caught Maya's attention. The groom stared directly at the camera with eyes that held something dark and possessive. His hand rested heavily on the bride's shoulder, not gently, but with a grip that seemed to claim ownership. His jaw was set, his posture aggressive despite the formal setting. The bride looked no older than 17 or 18. Her face was beautiful, but completely devoid of the joy one would expect on a wedding day. Her eyes showed something Maya had seen before in historical photographs of enslaved people, a combination of fear, resignation, and carefully hidden defiance. The young woman's hands were folded at her waist, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers, Black-Eyed Susans and Queen Anne's lace tied with a simple ribbon. Her posture was unnaturally stiff, almost defensive. Maya scanned the photograph into her computer and began her standard examination process, using digital enhancement software to examine details invisible to the naked eye. She zoomed in on the couple's faces first, noting the contrast between the groom's hardness and the bride's barely concealed terror. Then she focused on the bride's hands and the bouquet she held. At first, Maya saw only the flowers, but as she increased the magnification and adjusted the image contrast, something else became visible between the bride's fingers, a metallic glint, partially obscured by the flower stems and the folds of her dress. Maya enhanced the image further, her pulse quickening. It was a blade, small but unmistakable, a folding knife or perhaps a straight razor, gripped tightly in the bride's right hand, positioned at an angle that suggested readiness to use it. The bride's knuckles appeared white from the force of her grip. Maya sat back, staring at the screen. This wasn't just a wedding portrait. This was documentation of something far darker. A young woman who felt she needed a weapon on what should have been the happiest day of her life. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written, Clara, March 1907. The day everything changed. Maya knew immediately that she had to discover Clara's story. This photograph was screaming a truth that had been silent for over a century. Maya spent the next several days immersed in research, building a picture of what life was like for black women in rural Alabama in 1907. The reality she uncovered was suffocating in its brutality. 42 years after the official end of slavery, black people in the Deep South lived under a system that replicated many aspects of bondage. Jim Crow laws enforced strict racial segregation. The Ku Klux Klan operated with impunity, using terror and violence to maintain white supremacy. Black citizens had virtually no legal rights. They couldn't vote, couldn't testify against white people in court, and had no recourse when subjected to violence or theft. But Maya focused her research on a specific aspect of post-slavery oppression, the sharecropping system and what were called debt marriages. Sharecropping was designed to keep black families in perpetual economic bondage. White landowners allowed black families to work plots of land in exchange for a share of the crop. But families had to purchase everything they needed, seeds, tools, food, clothing, from the landowner's store on credit at inflated prices. At harvest time, after the landowner took his share and deducted debts, families typically owed more than they'd earned. The debt carried over to the next year, growing with interest. Legally, families couldn't leave until debts were paid, which meant they could never leave at all. Maya found court records showing that sharecropping debts were treated as inheritable and transferable. When a man died, his debt passed to his widow and children. And in some cases, documented in sparse legal records and church archives, debts could be settled through arrangements involving daughters. She discovered testimonies collected by early sociologists and reformers in the 1930s, oral histories from elderly black people who remembered the practice. One woman, interviewed in 1936, described how her sister had been given to a man in 1908 to settle their father's debt. Papa owed Mr. Green nearly $200. There was no way to pay it. Mr. Green said he'd forgive the debt if my sister married him. She was 16 years old. She had no choice. If she refused, they'd have thrown our whole family off the land, maybe arrested Papa for debt. My sister cried for 3 days, then she married him. These debt marriages existed in a legal gray area, not officially sanctioned, but rarely prosecuted. They were private arrangements between men, with daughters treated as property that could satisfy financial obligations. Maya found documentation of the violence that often accompanied these marriages. Medical records from black doctors, the only physicians who would treat black patients, showed patterns of injuries consistent with domestic abuse. Church records contained coded references to women suffering at home and prayers for sisters in distress. The legal system offered no protection. Husbands had virtually unlimited authority over their wives. Domestic discipline was considered a man's right, and only the most extreme cases of violence, those resulting in death or severe disfigurement, might be investigated, and even then, prosecution was rare. Black women had few options. Leaving a marriage required resources most women didn't have: money, transportation, a place to go, a way to support themselves. Divorce was legally available but practically impossible for poor black women to obtain, and any woman who left her husband risked being forcibly returned, arrested for abandonment, or worse. Maya understood now why Clara had hidden a blade in her wedding bouquet. She was entering a situation where violence was not only possible but likely, and she had no legal protection or social recourse. The knife represented her only means of self-defense. But who was Clara, and what had happened to her after that photograph was taken? Maya contacted the Alabama Department of Archives and History, requesting access to marriage records, property deeds, and church records from Macon County around 1907. She needed to identify Clara and trace what became of her. The response from the Alabama Archives arrived within a week. Maya opened the email attachment and found a digitized marriage record. Clara Washington, age 17, married to Marcus Green, age 28, March 15, 1907, Shorter's Crossing Baptist Church, Macon County, Alabama. Maya immediately searched for information about Shorter's Crossing. It was a tiny rural community that still existed, though with a much smaller population than in 1907. The church mentioned in the marriage record was still standing, now serving as a community museum and historical site. She found a phone number for the current pastor, Reverend Jonathan Price, and called immediately. Reverend Price, my name is Dr. Maya Robinson from the Smithsonian. I'm researching a marriage that took place at your church in 1907 between Clara Washington and Marcus Green. I'm hoping you might have records or know family histories that could help me understand what happened. There was a long pause on the line. Dr. Robinson, that's a name I know. Marcus Green, he's part of our church's darker history. My great-grandmother kept diaries about the people in this community, and Marcus Green appears in them, not in a good way. Would you be willing to share those diaries with me? More than willing. In fact, I think you should come to Shorter's Crossing yourself. There are people here whose families remember stories about Marcus Green and the women who suffered because of him. And Dr. Robinson, if the woman in your photograph is Clara Washington, I need to warn you, her story doesn't have a simple ending. Maya booked a flight to Montgomery for the following week. While she waited, she researched Marcus Green, searching census records, property deeds, and any other documentation she could find. The 1900 census showed Marcus Green living alone in Macon County, listed as a farm laborer. But by the 1910 census, he owned 40 acres of land, a remarkable achievement for a black man in that era. How had he acquired property so quickly? Maya found property records showing Green had purchased the land in 1905 for cash, $200, an enormous sum for a black farm worker. Where had the money come from? She discovered a reference to Green in a 1906 newspaper article about labor recruitment. Several black men from Macon County had been recruited to work in turpentine camps in Georgia, with promises of good wages. The article mentioned Green as someone helping to organize labor opportunities for the colored community. Maya's stomach tightened. Labor recruitment in that era was often a euphemism for something much darker, a system that trapped people in conditions barely distinguishable from slavery. As she prepared for her trip to Alabama, Maya studied Clara's photograph again. That young woman holding her flowers and hiding a blade? What had she endured? Had she used the knife to defend herself? Had she escaped? Had she survived? The photograph showed a moment frozen in time, but Maya knew that behind that moment lay a story of suffering, resistance, and possibly courage that deserved to be told. She printed several copies of the photograph to bring to Shorter's Crossing. Someone there would remember Clara Washington. Someone would know what happened to the terrified bride who had armed herself on her wedding day. Maya drove into Shorter's Crossing on a humid Saturday morning in late September. The landscape hadn't changed much in over a century. Cotton fields still stretched to the horizon, and small houses dotted the rural roads. The town itself consisted of little more than a crossroads, a post office, a gas station, a small store, and the church. Shorter's Crossing Baptist Church was a modest brick building constructed in the 1950s, but behind it stood the original wooden structure from 1871, now preserved as a community museum. The old building's white paint had faded to gray, and the steps sagged slightly, but it had been maintained with obvious care and respect. Reverend Price met Maya in the parking lot. He was in his mid-60s with graying hair and eyes that carried the weight of knowing difficult truths about his community's past. Dr. Robinson, thank you for making the trip. I've been looking forward to meeting you. He shook her hand warmly. I've also invited someone else who needs to hear this story. Miss Beatrice Taylor is 92 years old and has lived in Shorter's Crossing her entire life. Her mother knew Clara Washington personally. Maya's heart raced. A direct connection to Clara, someone whose mother had actually known her. Inside the old church building, the wooden pews were still intact. and the walls displayed photographs and documents chronicling the black community's history. An elderly woman sat in the front pew, leaning on a carved wooden cane. Despite her age, her eyes were sharp and alert. "Miss Beatrice," Reverend Price said gently, "this is Dr. Robinson from the Smithsonian. She found a photograph of Clara Washington's wedding and wants to know what happened to her." Beatrice studied Maya for a long moment before speaking. "My mama was Lucy Taylor. She was Clara's friend, part of a group of women who tried to help each other survive terrible situations. Mama told me Clara's story many times before she died. It's a story that needs to be told properly." Maya pulled out the photograph and handed it to Beatrice. The old woman's hands trembled as she held it, tears forming in her eyes. "Lord have mercy," Beatrice whispered. "I've heard about this photograph, but never seen it. Look at her face. She knew exactly what was waiting for her." "The blade," Maya said quietly. "Did you know she was hiding a knife?" Beatrice nodded. "Mrs. Esther Price, the Reverend's great-grandmother, gave Clara that knife the morning of the wedding. Told her to keep it close and use it if Marcus raised his hand to her. Mrs. Esther was a deaconess at this church and one of the few people brave enough to help women in Clara's situation." Reverend Price opened a leather-bound journal, his great-grandmother's diary. "Everything is documented here. Esther wrote about Clara's forced marriage, about Marcus Green's violence, and about what happened in the months after the wedding. Would you like me to read it to you?" "Please," Maya said, pulling out her recorder with Beatrice's permission. Reverend Price found the entry, dated March 15th, 1907, and began reading in a steady voice. "Today I witnessed a marriage that broke my heart. Clara Washington, only 17 years old, was wed to Marcus Green to settle her father's debt. The girl stood at the altar with terror in her eyes, knowing the fate that awaited her. Marcus Green is known in this community as a violent man whose first wife died under suspicious circumstances. Before the ceremony, I pressed a small folding knife into Clara's hand and told her, 'Child, you keep this with you always. If he raises his hand to you, you defend yourself.' She thanked me with tears streaming down her face. Maya felt her own tears forming as the full weight of Clara's situation became clear. Reverend Price turned the pages of his great-grandmother's diary carefully, the brittle paper crackling softly. Maya leaned forward, recording every word as he read aloud entries that documented the months following Clara's forced marriage. "March 22nd, 1907. I saw Clara at market today. She wore long sleeves despite the heat, but I glimpsed bruises on her wrists when she reached for vegetables. She avoided my eyes and spoke barely above a whisper. Marcus stood nearby, watching her like a hawk watches prey. My heart aches for this child." Beatrice interjected quietly. "Mama said Marcus started beating Clara within the first week of marriage. He was a man who believed he owned his wife completely and could do whatever he wanted to her." Reverend Price continued. "April 7th, 1907. Clara came to church with her face swollen on one side. She claimed she had fallen, but we all knew the truth. After services, I pulled her aside and asked if she'd use the knife to defend herself. She said she kept it hidden in her dress, but was too frightened to use it. She said, 'If I fight back and fail to stop him, he'll kill me. I have to wait for the right moment.'" Maya absorbed these words, understanding the impossible calculation Clara had to make: defend herself too soon and risk death, wait too long and suffer more abuse. April 28th, 1907. Devastating news. Clara is pregnant. She came to me in tears, terrified of bringing a child into this situation. She knows Marcus will use the baby as another way to control her, another chain binding her to him. I tried to offer comfort, but what comfort can I give when the situation is so hopeless? Beatrice shifted in her seat, her expression pained. "Mama told me Clara lost that baby. Marcus beat her so badly she miscarried." Reverend Price found the entry. May 19th, 1907. Dr. Coleman, our community's only colored physician, came to the church seeking counsel. He treated Clara yesterday for injuries that caused her to lose the child she carried. The doctor says Marcus beat her in the stomach and back repeatedly. Dr. Coleman wanted to report it to authorities, but I had to explain the futility. The white sheriff won't arrest a colored man for disciplining his wife, and even if he did, the courts would side with the husband's rights. Maya felt physically ill hearing these accounts. The systematic denial of protection, the casual acceptance of violence, the complete powerlessness of women like Clara. It was overwhelming. "How did Clara survive this?" Maya asked. Beatrice answered, "She survived because she was smart and because she wasn't alone. After losing the baby, Clara started organizing. She realized she couldn't escape or fight Marcus by herself, but maybe she could create a network of women who would help each other." Reverend Price turned to another section of the diary. June 10th, 1907. "Clara has done something remarkable. She's organized what she calls quilting circles, groups of women meeting weekly at different houses to sew together. But I know these gatherings are about more than quilting. Clara is building a network of women in similar situations, sharing information about safe houses, resources, and strategies for survival. 7 women now attend regularly, all trapped in marriages with violent men." "Your mother was part of this group?" Maya asked Beatrice. "Yes. Mama married my daddy through another debt arrangement when she was 15. Daddy was a drunk who beat her regularly. Clara's network gave Mama hope that maybe someday she could escape, even if it took years. Reverend Price read more entries documenting the network's activities throughout the summer and fall of 1907. The women shared strategies for hiding small amounts of money, created coded warnings to alert each other when husbands were particularly dangerous, and documented their injuries in case evidence was ever needed. October 15th, 1907. Clara asked me to do something dangerous, photograph the women's injuries to create permanent evidence of the violence they endure. I agreed, understanding that someday this documentation might matter, even if it doesn't matter now in our unjust legal system. Maya realized the significance of this. These women were creating an archive of their own suffering, preserving truth even when no one would listen. Exactly, Reverend Price said, and Clara was at the center of it all. Despite her own suffering, she was organizing resistance. Reverend Price turned to entries from late 1907 and early 1908, where the diary documented something remarkable. Clara's network was helping women escape. November 3rd, 1907. Clara came to me with an audacious plan. She wants to create an underground route for women fleeing violence, similar to the routes colored people used during slavery times. She's identified families in Tennessee and Georgia who might provide shelter, and she's mapped paths through the woods that avoid main roads where fleeing women might be caught. Beatrice leaned forward, eager to add context. You have to understand, this was incredibly dangerous. If Marcus or any of the other husbands discovered what Clara was doing, they would have killed her. But Clara believed the risk was worth it if even one woman could escape. November 20th, 1907, the network achieved its first success. Sarah Johnson, whose husband broke her arm twice this year, has fled to her sister's house in Chattanooga. Clara organized the escape, providing Sarah with hidden savings, a map of safe houses, and contacts in Tennessee. Sarah left in the middle of the night while her husband was passed out drunk. By the time he woke, she was miles away. Maya felt a surge of admiration. Clara wasn't just surviving her own abuse. She was actively dismantling the system that trapped women in violent marriages. How did the husbands react? Maya asked. With fury, Beatrice said. Mama told me that Sarah's husband went house to house demanding to know who helped his wife escape, but the women had prepared alibis and no one broke. The men suspected Clara was involved, but they had no proof. Reverend Price continued. December 8th, 1907. Another woman has successfully escaped using Clara's network. Martha Lewis made it to Birmingham, where the Colored Women's Club found her work and shelter. Her husband is threatening violence against anyone who helped her. But again, no one is talking. Clara has taught the women how to protect each other through coordinated silence. January 15th, 1908. Clara is expanding the network. She's established connections with Quaker families in Tennessee, who help colored people fleeing violence, and with colored women's clubs in several cities that provide shelter and employment assistance. What started as a small quilting circle has become an organized resistance movement. Maya was documenting everything, understanding that this was a hidden history of black women's activism that predated the civil rights movement by decades. Clara and women like her were creating social service networks that wouldn't exist officially for another 50 years. But Reverend Price's expression darkened as he turned to entries from February and March 1908. This is where the story takes a dangerous turn. Marcus Green figured out what Clara was doing, and he decided to stop her. He read, February 20th, 1908. Marcus came to the church in a rage today, accusing me of helping his wife plot against him. He knows Clara is at the center of the network helping women leave their husbands. He made explicit threats against her life. I fear what comes next. What did come next? Maya asked, though she dreaded the answer. Beatrice's eyes filled with tears. March 15th, 1908. Exactly 1 year after Clara's forced wedding. Marcus beat her worse than ever before. Mama said Clara could barely walk when she came to our house that night. But Clara didn't come to us for sympathy. She came to tell us she was running, and before she left, she was going to expose Marcus for something even worse than being a wife beater. Worse than domestic violence? Maya asked, confused. Reverend Price pulled out additional documents he'd prepared. Newspaper clippings and legal records. Marcus Green wasn't just an abusive husband. He was what they called a labor agent, profiting from recruiting colored people into peonage, forced labor camps that were essentially slavery under another name. Reverend Price spread several documents across the table, old newspaper articles, court records, and letters that exposed a brutal system of exploitation that had operated across the South in the early 1900s. After the Civil War ended slavery, he explained, Southern industries still needed cheap labor. They couldn't legally own people anymore, so they created systems that trapped people in conditions barely distinguishable from slavery. One of those systems was peonage. He showed Maya an article from the Montgomery Advertiser, dated 1906. Labor agents continued to recruit Negro workers for turpentine camps, lumber operations, and mining ventures across the region. Workers signed contracts for transportation and lodging, then find themselves bound to the work through accumulating debts. How does this connect to Marcus Green? Maya asked. Beatrice answered, her voice heavy with disgust. Marcus was one of those labor agents. He'd go into poor colored communities and recruit people with promises of good wages and fair treatment. But once people signed contracts and traveled to the work camps, they'd discover they'd been tricked. Reverend Price read from his great-grandmother's diary. January 25th, 1908. Clara made a horrifying discovery. While searching Marcus's belongings for money to hide away, she found a ledger book documenting his work as a labor agent. Inside were names, dates, and amounts paid, records of every person Marcus delivered to labor camps over the past 3 years. Clara recognized some of the names. Young men from our community who supposedly went north to find work but actually were sent to turpentine camps in Georgia. Marcus was selling people? Maya said, horrified. Essentially, yes, Reverend Price confirmed. Labor agents received payments for every worker they delivered, typically $5 to $10 per person, which was substantial money. Over 3 years, Marcus had delivered dozens of people into forced labor, earning enough to buy his 40-acre farm. He showed Maya a federal government report from 1908 documenting peonage conditions. Workers at these camps were housed in locked barracks, forced to work without pay, beaten if they tried to escape, and kept in debt through manipulated accounting of expenses for food, housing, and tools. People who tried to leave were arrested for breach of contract and either jailed or returned to the camps. This practice was technically illegal under federal law, Reverend Price explained, but southern states rarely enforced those laws. The Justice Department was just beginning to crack down on peonage in 1908, conducting raids and prosecutions. And Clara found evidence of Marcus's involvement? Maya asked. Beatrice nodded. Clara copied every name and location from Marcus's ledger book. She realized that if she could get this information to federal authorities, she might be able to free the people Marcus had trapped and expose the entire system. Ours. Reverend Price read more from the diary. February 10th, 1908. Clara showed me the evidence she's collected. She has names of 43 people Marcus delivered to camps, locations of the facilities, dates of recruitment, and amounts Marcus was paid. She plans to take this information to federal prosecutors in Birmingham when she flees. She says, I can't just save myself, I have to save the people Marcus sold. Maya understood now the full scope of what Clara had been planning. She wasn't just escaping domestic violence. She was preparing to expose a criminal network and potentially free dozens of people from forced labor. What happened when Marcus discovered what Clara was doing? Maya asked. Reverend Price's face grew grim. March 15th, 1908. Marcus somehow learned that Clara had found his ledger and was planning to report him. The beating he gave her that night was intended to kill her or at least terrify her into silence, but it had the opposite effect. It convinced Clara that she had to run immediately, that she had to expose Marcus even if it cost her life. Beatrice took over the storytelling, her voice carrying the weight of memories passed down from her mother. That night, March 15th, 1908. Clara came to our house, barely able to walk. Her face was swollen, her ribs were broken, and she was coughing blood. Mama cleaned her up while I watched from the doorway, though I was only 5 years old. Maya leaned closer, recording every detail. Clara told Mama she was leaving that night. She had the copied evidence from Marcus's ledger hidden in her dress, and she planned to walk to Tuskegee, about 12 miles away, to catch the early morning train to Birmingham. But Daddy came home and warned her that Marcus had sent men to watch the train station. Someone had tipped Marcus off that Clara might run. Reverend Price picked up the diary. March 15th, 1908. Late evening. Clara cannot reach the train station. Marcus's associates are watching all the main routes. Lucy Taylor's husband, despite his many faults, has agreed to help Clara escape using the old underground paths that colored people used during slavery. These routes through the woods and between safe houses still exist, maintained by families who understand that freedom often requires running and hiding. Daddy knew those paths, Beatrice explained. His own brother had tried to escape from a labor camp years earlier and died trying. Daddy hated the labor agents with a passion. So even though he was a drunk and beat Mama, he did one good thing in his life. He helped Clara get away. What was the escape route? Maya asked. Clara would travel on foot at night, moving from one safe house to another. The network she'd built to help abused women became her own lifeline. Families all along the route north, into Tallapoosa County, then across the Georgia border into Chattanooga, agreed to shelter her during the day while she hid and rested. Reverend Price read, March 16th, 1908. Clara and Lucy's husband left before dawn. The plan is for him to guide her for the first 15 miles to the Freeman family's farm, then return before Marcus notices he's gone. From there, other families will help Clara move north. Each family will pass her to the next, like a precious package that must arrive safely at its destination. Did she make it? Maya asked. Beatrice smiled. She did. Over the next week, we received coded messages through the network. Children delivering verbal reports, women passing information while doing laundry or shopping. Clara reached Chattanooga safely by March 22nd. Reverend Price continued reading the diary entries that tracked Clara's progress. March 18th, Clara reached the Freeman farm safely. March 20th, she crossed into Tallapoosa County. March 26th, word arrived that Clara made it to Chattanooga and is staying with a family connected to the CME church. But Clara didn't just save herself, Beatrice added. Remember, she had evidence about the peonage system. Before she ran, Clara gave copies of that evidence to 3 people. Mrs. Esther, Mama, and one other woman whose name was kept secret for safety. Reverend Price pulled out a faded letter preserved in the diary. This letter was sent by Esther to federal prosecutors in Birmingham on March 20th, 1908, just days after Clara escaped. It contained all the information Clara had copied from Marcus's ledger. Names, dates, locations, payments. Esther explained the situation and urged immediate investigation. Maya examined the letter carefully. It was formal but powerful. Gentlemen, I write to report a crime against humanity occurring in our state. A man named Marcus Green of Shorter's Crossing has been operating as a labor agent, delivering colored people into conditions of forced labor and peonage. I have documentary evidence listing 43 individuals he has sold into these camps. I urge you to investigate and free these people from bondage. Did the federal government respond? Maya asked. They did, Reverend Price said, pulling out a newspaper clipping from April 1908. The headline read, Federal Marshals Raid Labor Camps in Georgia. 43 workers freed from peonage conditions. Maya stared at the article, amazed. Clara's evidence worked. The raid happened because of what she provided. It did more than free those specific people, Beatrice said. The raid led to prosecutions of several labor agents and camp operators. The publicity helped the Justice Department build momentum for their broader crackdown on peonage. Clara's courage saved lives and helped dismantle part of the system. What happened to Marcus? Maya asked. Reverend Price's expression darkened. Marcus disappeared the day before federal marshals came to Shorter's Crossing looking for him. Someone tipped him off, probably another labor agent. He abandoned his farm and fled, possibly to Texas or Mississippi. He was never prosecuted. So he escaped justice. From the legal system, yes, Beatrice said, but the community had its own form of justice. After Marcus fled, his farm was seized by the county for unpaid taxes. Mrs. Esther and the Women's Network arranged for the property to be purchased by a cooperative of colored families. They divided the land and worked it together. Marcus's blood money became something good. Reverend Price carefully opened a folder containing letters that had been preserved for over a century. After Clara reached Chattanooga, she stayed connected to the network through carefully coded correspondence. She knew Marcus might still be looking for her, so she changed her name and moved several times over the next few years. He pulled out the first letter, dated June 1908, written in neat handwriting. Dear friends, I am safe and well. I found work as a seamstress and have rented a small room. The people here have been kind. I think constantly about home and everyone I left behind, but I know I can never return. Please tell the women in our circle that I carry them in my heart and that the work must continue. With love, C. Clara used only her initial in letters, Beatrice explained, and she never included a return address. Everything came through intermediaries to protect her location. Maya examined more letters spanning from 1908 to 1915. They documented Clara's gradual rebuilding of her life, moving from Chattanooga to Nashville, developing her skills as a seamstress, and eventually connecting with other women who had escaped violence. A letter from 1910 revealed something significant. I have joined a group here called the Women's Protective League. We provide shelter and assistance to women fleeing dangerous situations. I finally understand that what happened to me in Alabama was not unique. Women everywhere face the same violence, the same lack of protection, the same need for networks of support. The work we started in Shorter's Crossing is happening here too, just on a larger scale. Reverend Price pulled out a newspaper clipping from the Nashville Banner, dated 1912. The Women's Protective League, an organization of Negro women dedicated to assisting those in distress, has opened a boarding house on Charlotte Avenue where women may find temporary refuge. Mrs. Clara Brown serves as the organization's secretary. Clara Brown, Maya said. She took a new name. Brown was common enough not to draw attention, Beatrice said. And it protected her from anyone who might be searching for Clara Washington or Clara Green. The documents showed Clara's growing involvement in social reform work throughout the 1910s. She spoke to church groups about domestic violence, testified before city councils about the need for legal protections for women, and helped establish safe houses in multiple cities. A letter from 1917 showed Clara's expanding vision. We are not just saving individual women anymore. We are building a movement. Women across the South are organizing similar networks, sharing strategies, and demanding changes to laws that leave us unprotected. What began in a small Alabama church is spreading. We are becoming visible and powerful. Reverend Price showed Maya a photograph from 1920, a formal portrait of women from the Women's Protective League. Standing in the center, dignified and confident, was Clara Brown. Maya compared it to the terrified bride from 1907. The transformation was profound. Clara never married again, Beatrice said quietly. Mama asked her about that once in a letter, and Clara wrote back, I had one marriage forced upon me, and I will never give anyone that power over my life again. My work is my purpose, and the women I help are my family. Throughout the 1920s and into the 1930s, Clara continued her advocacy work. The documents showed her involvement in multiple organizations, the National Association of Colored Women, the NAACP, and various church-based social service groups. A 1935 newspaper article reported, Mrs. Clara Brown, longtime advocate for women's rights and founder of several shelters for women in distress, addressed our assembly yesterday. She spoke powerfully about the need for legal reforms to protect women from violence and economic coercion. Her testimony was based on decades of experience helping women escape dangerous situations. Did Clara ever try to come back to Alabama? Maya asked. Did she ever see Shorter's Crossing again? Beatrice shook her head sadly. Never. It was too dangerous. Even decades later, there were people who might remember Clara Washington and what she'd done, exposing the labor agents, helping women escape. Marcus had disappeared, but his associates hadn't. Clara lived the rest of her life in exile from the place where she was born. When did she die? 1952, Reverend Price said. She was 62 years old. She died of a heart attack while working at a shelter in Memphis, still serving others until her final day. He showed Maya a funeral program. The service had been held at a large church in Memphis and was attended by hundreds of people whose lives Clara had touched over 4 decades of advocacy work. After Clara died, the Memphis newspaper ran an obituary describing her as a pioneering social reformer, Reverend Price said. But the obituary didn't mention Alabama, didn't mention Marcus Green or the forced marriage, didn't mention the violence she'd survived. All of that history was buried with her. Until now, Maya said quietly. 6 months after discovering Clara's wedding photograph, Maya stood in the Smithsonian's exhibition hall, surveying the completed display titled Hidden Resistance, Clara Washington, and the Underground Networks of Women's Survival. The exhibition opened with Clara's wedding photograph displayed prominently, that young woman holding flowers, the blade barely visible in her hand. But now, visitors would understand the full context. The forced marriage, the systematic violence, the courage to resist, and the decades of work helping other women survive. The exhibition told Clara's complete story through carefully curated materials. Esther's diary entries, the copied evidence from Marcus Green's ledger, letters documenting Clara's escape and her life's work, photographs of the Women's Protective League, and testimonies from descendants of women Clara had helped. One section explained the broader context of debt marriages and peonage, showing how these systems trapped black families in economic bondage and subjected women to violence without legal recourse. Another section highlighted the underground networks that helped women escape, the safe houses, the coded communications, and the families who risked everything to assist those fleeing violence. Maya had invited Beatrice Taylor to attend the exhibition opening. Now 93 years old and in a wheelchair, Beatrice was surrounded by her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, several of whom worked in domestic violence services, continuing Clara's legacy in modern form. As news cameras and reporters gathered, Beatrice sat in front of Clara's photograph, her weathered hand reaching out to touch the image. "This photograph used to represent everything terrible about that era," Beatrice said to the crowd. A young girl forced into marriage carrying a weapon to her own wedding because she knew violence awaited her. But now I see it differently. This photograph shows resistance. It shows a woman who refused to be helpless, who armed herself literally and figuratively, and who spent her life fighting so other women wouldn't have to suffer as she did. A reporter asked, "Miss Taylor, what do you want people to understand about Clara's story?" Beatrice thought carefully before responding. "I want people to know that resistance doesn't always look dramatic. Clara didn't lead marches or make speeches, at least not at first. She organized quilting circles. She mapped safe routes through the woods. She copied names from a ledger book. She helped women one at a time. That quiet, persistent work saved lives and built networks that lasted for generations." Maya added her own reflection. "When I first found this photograph, I saw a tragic image of oppression. But through research, I discovered it was actually documentation of resistance. Clara hid a blade in her flowers because she refused to be defenseless. She documented Marcus Green's crimes because she refused to let evil operate in secret. She built networks because she understood that women helping women could transform an unjust society." The exhibition drew thousands of visitors over the following months. Many were descendants of women who had been helped by Clara's networks. Others came because they worked in domestic violence services and wanted to understand the historical roots of their profession. Still others came simply to witness a hidden history finally being acknowledged. 3 months after the opening, Maya received a letter from a woman in Memphis named Dorothy Mae Johnson, age 98. The letter explained that Dorothy had been a young woman working at the Women's Protective League shelter in Memphis in the 1940s, and she had known Clara personally. "Clara never talked much about her past," Dorothy wrote, "but near the end of her life, she gave me a journal and asked me to keep it safe until the right time. She said someday someone would come looking for her story, and when that happened, I should give them this journal. I believe you are that person." Maya traveled to Memphis immediately. Dorothy handed her a worn leather journal with Clara's name embossed on the cover. Inside was Clara's own account of her life, from the forced marriage, through her escape, and 4 decades of advocacy work. Reading Clara's words was like hearing her voice across time. "I carried that knife on my wedding day, not knowing if I would ever need to use it. In the end, I never used it to defend myself from Marcus. I escaped before it came to that. But I kept it for years, afterward, as a reminder that survival is an act of resistance, that we have the right to protect ourselves, and that sometimes the most radical thing we can do is simply refuse to accept the fate others have assigned us." Maya spent a year preparing Clara's journal for publication, working with historians and domestic violence experts to provide context and analysis. The book, titled The Blade and the Flowers, Clara Washington's Journey from Violence to Advocacy, became required in reading and women's studies courses and inspired renewed research into hidden histories of black women's resistance. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome was what happened in Shorter's Crossing. The old church where Clara had married Marcus in 1907 was designated a historical landmark and transformed into a museum dedicated to the history of black women's resistance in rural Alabama. On the day of the museum's dedication, Maya stood with Beatrice, now 94, in front of the church. Inside, Clara's wedding photograph hung alongside photographs of the Women's Protective League, copies of Esther's diary, and testimonies from descendants of the women who had been part of Clara's network. Clara lived in exile for 44 years, Beatrice said to the assembled crowd, her voice still strong despite her age. She could never come home because it wasn't safe, but today we're bringing her home in memory and honoring what she did. This museum stands as testimony that her courage mattered, that the lives she saved mattered, and that the network she built changed our community forever. Maya added, "This photograph of Clara on her wedding day, the terrified bride hiding a blade in her flowers, is no longer just an image of suffering. It's become a symbol of resistance, survival, and the unbreakable spirit of women who refuse to accept violence as their fate." Clara's story reminds us that resistance takes many forms, that courage can be quiet but still powerful, and that one person's decision to fight back can ripple forward through generations, changing countless lives. As Maya looked at the photograph one final time, she saw not just the fear in Clara's eyes, but also the determination. That young woman had been forced into an impossible situation, but she had armed herself, documented evidence, built networks, escaped violence, and spent her life helping others do the same. The blade hidden in the flowers wasn't just a weapon. It was a promise Clara made to herself, that she would survive, that she would resist, and that she would transform her suffering into a force for change. And 70 years after her death, that promise was finally being honored.